This conference will now be recorded.
Great. Hey, thank you, all of you. Welcome to a very, very special uh, Leadership Council meeting. And I want to thank everybody for joining us, particularly Dr. Cerf. So if you're new to Secure the Village, I'm Stan Stahl. I'm the president of Secure the Village. And basically, Secure the Village, we're like the last mile, I feel, for information security and privacy. I mean, we got to get it from all the great, wonderful things that are being done by the people who understand security and get it to from the boardroom to the living room, everywhere, turning people and organizations what we call cyber guardians, get everybody involved. I think of it some ways as a Dunkirk moment. We've got to get the people involved to get this done right. And of course, from our perspective, it takes the village to secure the village. As we get going, if you've got questions, please post them to the chat. We'll try to pick those up. And as well, mute your phones. So just let's keep the sound down that way. With that, first, again, we are so grateful, Dr. Cerf, to have you on this Leadership Council meeting. For those, I mean, I would hope you would all know, but Dr. Cerf is regarded as the father of the internet. He co-designed the underlying protocol that we use for that. Among your awards, among his rewards, he's National Medal of Technology from President Clinton, the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Bush, and to me, far more important than either of those is the Association of Computing Manufacturers Alan Turing Award. It's often referred to as the Nobel Prize of Computer Science, and having personally been having studied Turing's work in my own mathematical career, it's just such an award. With that, I'm going to turn it over to George Usi to further introduce Dr. Cerf. George is a Secure the Village board member, founder and president of Omnistruct, which is a very people-centered company, security metrics company. He chairs the California IPv6 task force, and he was recognized by his peers as an internet pioneer for work that he did, designing interoperable first responders so that emergency workers could coordinate with each other during disasters. George, let me thank you for inviting Dr. Cerf, for bringing him on board and to this meeting, and let me turn it over to you for now.
Thanks, Vince. Thanks, Stan. And Vint, welcome. Can you hear us?
Glad to be here.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, first, I just wanted to thank everyone for taking the time today to get together and be part of our community, Secure the Village. We appreciate everyone in the Leadership Council. I can't thank everyone enough for all of their work, as well as for focusing on a people-centered movement that is creating cyber guardians in the Los Angeles community. So first off, so how do I know Vinton and I know each other? On occasion, we've worked together. I would say that that Dr. Cerf has been one of a handful of my key mentors for more than 2 decades in advocating the growth and upgrade of the internet. In the 90s, a lot of engineers like me recognized that the internet was growing at an unexpectedly phenomenal pace that would require an upgrade of the internet itself to something called IPv6, which is a roomier and better internet foundation. And that will allow for continued internet growth that improves information accessibility. So we have Vint and many of his pioneer brethren like Larry Roberts, Bob Kahn, Tim Berners-Lee, and so many other scientists to thank for the internet's very existence. And I know from the early days of ARPANET, from its ideation and development of TCP/IP, coupled with this vision that would make digital information more accessible for everyone, the internet exists thanks to people like Vint. So thank you for that, Vint. I also believe internet success started with the mindset of an open and accessible network of digital information. This happened to evolve into an internet delivered digital world where information could be shared at scale. So, and I personally see Vint as someone with what I would say is an exceptional time span, kind of the ability to see into the future, specifically of our digital world evolution, and as one of the handful of people I know who understand the importance of people-centered initiatives. I would describe Vint as one of the best storytellers I know, who can clearly and concisely explain why the internet's fundamental purpose to share information freely makes the world a better place. So today, cybersecurity governance, much like internet governance, is evolving. And our hope is that we may learn from Vint's own journey and experiences to help us lead our movement better. So we're honored to have a slice of your time today, Vint, to share your thoughts and encouragement around how SecureTheVillage's leadership team, which is what this call is primarily comprised of, can build upon a people-centered idea to turn people in our communities into better cyber guardians. So we have a few questions that we'll be asking, but I'll turn it over to you, Vint, to tell us a little bit about what people-centered internet means to you, or people-centered movements mean to you.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for allowing me to take some of your time. Second, just to be sure everybody appreciates that the internet is not a one or two man thing. It's true that Bob Kahn and I started the basic work on the internet, but of course it rested on top of the ARPA network, which has also had a cadre of people, many of whom later turned out to contribute to internet. So there's lots of credit to go around for this now global scale system. With regard to people-centeredness, there's an organization that I think George knows about. It's called the People-Centered Internet. You can find it at peoplecentered.net. I used to chair that. I'm one of the co-founders. I've taken on some new responsibilities at Google, and so I had to step out of the board, but it's currently being run by the other co-founder, Mei-Lin Feng, who is sort of the mother of customer relationship management, CRM, when she was at Oracle. So she's very oriented towards people and their use of technology. So PCI cares a great deal about trying to get more people up on the internet and to make them safe, not only feel safe, but actually be safe, which is an objective that I think you must share as well. So I'd like to spend a few minutes, happy to respond to questions, but I really would like to spend a few minutes to tell you a little bit about where I think we are right now in terms of safety and security in the internet. And I would have to argue that we're not in a very good place right now. In the early days of internet's evolution, after starting when we turned it on in 1983, it was largely the realm of research community, the academic community. So we had Defense Department, we had NASA, we had DOE, we had NSF. Lots of universities were up on the network. But by 1989, commercial service emerged, and I encouraged that, believing that the general public wouldn't have access to the internet if there wasn't an economic engine to support it. And I didn't think the government was going to pay for everybody's personal use of the system. And then, of course, in late 91, the World Wide Web shows up from Tim Berners-Lee's work at CERN. It wasn't widely noted at that point. It was like December of 91. But when the Mosaic browser was developed at NCSA by Mark Andreessen and Eric Bina, that really got a lot of people's attention because of the graphical user interface that it offered. In fact, it was drawn to the attention of Jim Clark, who was the founder of Silicon Graphics, who brought Eric Bina and especially Mark Andreessen to the West Coast to start Netscape Communications, which produced the Netscape Navigator, one of the first GUI style browsers. And that really triggered an explosion of use. Content poured into the network. In fact, there was so much content that you couldn't find anything, and that's what led to the search engines like Alta Vista, and Yahoo, and Google, and Bing, and others. So as the system expanded in physical scope with number of users, machines, and everything else, and new applications, especially commercial applications, having the general public on board produced a side effect, which is that not all of the general public has everyone else's best interests at heart. That's why we still read Shakespeare, because 400 years later, he still tells us about all of the nasty foibles of human behavior. So we got an increasing amount of misbehavior on the network, the generation of malware, propagation of denial of service attacks or spam, and all kinds of other, fraud and abuse of various kinds, bullying. I mean, there's a long list. The technology itself is essentially neutral and essentially says, you know, if you've got an IP address and a computer that's got the right software, you can participate in this online environment. So we've been forced, partly by necessity, to improve the posture of security in the system. And I realize that I shouldn't waste too much time admiring this problem, since you've spent lots of time thinking about it as well. But I would like to point out a few things that resonate for me with what you're trying to do. One of them is to cope with the fact that the bulk of the internet is in private sector hands, and a significant amount of that, especially the laptops and desktops and pads and mobiles and the like, are in the hands of the general public, where we are most vulnerable, because the general public is not necessarily well schooled in how to protect itself, nor do we provide adequate tools for that protection, or convenient tools for that protection. And if you're like me, you may have come to the conclusion that security in the network has a kind of an insurmountable amount of inconvenience to it, some, you know, irreducible inconvenience associated with good security. For example, two-factor authentication, which I think is a very valuable concept, and one which I make use of myself at Google and in my interactions with banks. And just recently, I got yet another key fob for NIST, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. And so, as much as I like using those things because I feel like they are protecting me more than just usernames and passwords, I've also discovered that I have about 300 accounts in various places around the internet, and the idea of carrying a bag full of 300 dongles does not appeal to me at all. And so what's missing from the equation are devices that can carry large numbers of public keys and private keys and can be easily used to sign up for two-factor authentication for a wide range of websites. That's not available to first order. Standards are still kind of not so widely spread. I hope we have a better outcome with regard to security standards than we have had with IPv6, because that standard was released in 1996, and here it is 2020, and we are still about 30% penetrated on average, and that's inadequate for what we really need, which is full IPv6 capability everywhere. In fact, let me characterize it as IPv6 only capability. It doesn't mean you shouldn't run IPv4. You may need that for backward compatibility, but you should have systems that can run purely IPv6, and that's not the case today. There are a lot of systems that require you to use IPv4 maybe to get to a domain name resolver. So I don't want to rant on IPv6 particularly in this session, but I want to come back now to the situation as I see it right now. The first one is that we have not supplied adequate technology, easily used technology for the general public to secure itself. And I would argue that in the enterprise space, we have a similar problem. There are, I don't know, some significant number of businesses in the US. I don't remember what the absolute number is, but it seems like 30 million or something. Whatever it is, most of them are small. They have fewer than 10 employees. In fact, a lot of them, the bulk of them probably have 1 or 2 or 3 or something like that. So they don't have an IT department, and they don't know where to turn when they're trying to either fix something or set something up or deal with a denial of service attack or some other malware attack. And so I've been touting the idea of a cyber fire department, which makes me think a little bit of your term, cyber guardians. The idea there would be that the private sector should have a place to go when it's got a cyber fire. Now, whether or not we can actually implement that is kind of an open question. The state of Michigan actually has, I don't think they call it a cyber fire department, but they have a group of people that the general public can go to get help from problems with cyber attacks or cyber security problems. There is, however, a weakness in the analogy, and I think I feel like I should draw that to your attention. If a house in your neighborhood is on fire, it's actually not only okay for you to call the fire department, it's imperative that you call the fire department, because if the person whose house is on fire isn't home or doesn't have an automatic fire detection system that calls the fire department, you owe it to the rest of your neighbors and to yourself to call the fire department to put the fire out. When the fire department shows up, it also recognizes the importance of putting the fire out, so it breaks holes in the roofs and breaks the windows and pours water into the house, does all kinds of water damage and everything else in order to put the fire out, and we accept that as a side effect of having a fire. Now let's imagine, if we pursued this analogy, that there are these two companies, A and B, and let's pretend that George runs company A, and who will I pick on here? I'll pick on Rich. Is running company B, and there is a cyber fire department run by Stan, and so Rich and George are in competition with each other, and Rich, who I'm sure would never actually do this, but Rich notices that George is his competitor, and he decides to call Stan and say George's company is on cyber fire. And so Stan runs off and, disrupts George's operation, says, what's the problem? Let me get in and fix things. And so George is out of business for 3 days while Rich is happy as a clam. We can't just draw directly from the fire department analogy to figure out what's the legitimate thing for the cyber fire department to do. And so all that says is we have to think more carefully about exactly what that means. Let me give you another example of an idea I had, which may already have been pursued. I just don't have clarity on it. I wanted to get the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts to have merit badges for learning about cybersecurity and then helping people configure their laptops and desktops and Wi-Fi servers and their routers at home. And I thought that would be really great because there's lots of those kids and they're smart, and they would earn a merit badge out of that. And I think there are merit badges for cyber-related things, maybe even cybersecurity. But you can imagine a potential hazard. You're the Girl Scout organization or the Boy Scout organization, and one of your members goes and does something bad to somebody's house, or puts in malware while they're setting up and configuring the thing. So who's liable for that? And it gets especially worse because you get minors here who are not 18 years old. So I'm not sure how far that idea either has gone or could go, but it's a thought about trying to spread the knowledge of cybersecurity in the hands of people who are reasonably able to understand it, the young people who are comfortable in the cyberspace. So I don't know whether that is a feasible thing to do, but it's something that seemed attractive to me anyway. To come back now to the general situation that we have, imagine that you're NSA or the Department of Homeland Security. You have different responsibilities, NSA for outside the potential hazards and attacks and things coming from outside the US, and DHS is called appropriately Homeland Security. It's a domestic arm of concern for cyber and other security. The thing is that both of those organizations in theory may have useful knowledge, which if applied in the right way would help to protect the private sector, including you and me and our personal equipment, as well as our small businesses and medium-sized enterprises. But I don't think that we figured out a way to effectively use the knowledge that's in the hands of either DHS or NSA in order to inform good quality security posture. And part of the reason for that, of course, is some of the information classified. You can't share that with people who haven't been cleared. Nonetheless, I feel this need to explore ways in which those government agencies can not only protect what is often called the critical infrastructure of the United States, but I would spread the problem more broadly and say that we need to use their capabilities, if possible, in order to protect the private sector and ordinary citizens. So it feels to me like there's a whole lot of work to do here. It would certainly correct that cryptography has been helpful. Public key cryptography in particular, because it facilitates key distribution. But if any of you have used things like PGP, you've discovered that key distribution and key management is a hard problem, and it's a non-trivial problem. The most trivial example that I can think of is TLS, for example, where neither party needs to do very much because it's an exchange that takes place where keys are generated on the fly. The thing is that you don't necessarily get authentication out of that. You just get shared crypto variables, and therefore you have a confidential conversation. If you want authentication, you need to work harder. And so now we need digital signatures and certificates, but we've learned that certificates are vulnerable, or certificate authorities are vulnerable either to direct attack or bribery, for that matter, where somebody generates an inappropriate certificate. I'm sure you know stories about that. So the long and short of all this is that there is, in my opinion, a great deal of work to be done to educate the public, to provide tools for the public to use technology to protect themselves, and to facilitate protection in the private sector, in addition to what we normally think of as the defense industrial base, plus all of our federal facilities. Last point I would like to make is that the reason that we have all these problems is that people write crappy software. And, you know, for the last 80 years, we, not me, I'm not that old, but people have been trying to program computers of various kinds. And as far as I can tell, over that 8-decade period, we have not learned to write software that doesn't have exploitable bugs. And so I turn to the academic community, shaking my finger and saying that it's your responsibility for figuring out how to build better software environments so we can avoid stupid mistakes. And you know what they are, you know, off by one bug in a loop, referencing a variable that hasn't been set yet. So you do a conditional branch to nowhere, or you know, nowhere in particular. Or you do an input call and you have a buffer that wasn't big enough because you didn't look carefully at what's the maximum size, and you get buffer overflow, and you get people who exploit that by falling into you know, execution of a program that wasn't intended. And you know, there's a long list of the various things we have at Google. We have an organization that we acquired called VirusTotal. Some of you are probably familiar with that. And it accumulates new known virus profiles at a prodigious rate, which just tells us that the problem is rampant. I've been tempted to, you remember a term called phrenology, which is the shape of your skull, and it used to be that people thought they could figure out what your behavior patterns were based on the shape of your skull. Well, I would like to suggest to you that most programmers have a small dent in their forehead here from hitting their forehead saying, man, that was a stupid mistake. How could I do that? Well, look, I'll stop there with the dent in my forehead. Clearly, I could go on and on because I'm an old Stanford professor who's capable of doing that for at least 50 minutes without, even if I don't know anything about what I'm talking about. But I'll stop and find out whether you want to react, ask questions, hang up the phone, or talk about something else.
Well, first, I just want to say, wow. I mean, what a tour de force you just took us through. Thank you so very, very much for that. One piece that just really resonated with me, because it's part of what we've been working to do, is your discussion about the NSA, Department of Homeland Security, kind of helping the private sector. We actually have we run an information security management webinar once a month, and our November speakers from Homeland Security, part of CISA, and another group we run is Financial Services Roundtable once a month, and we just had the FBI speaking. My sense is they're very happy and willing to do all of this, but there's like a barrier between the way they see the world, very top down, and the way business kind of works, which is very bottom up. if you've got any insights into how we can connect these dots better, just segueing off of your talk, I'd love to hear it.
So, this really is a hard problem. There's confusion too about exactly what it is that is to be secured. And for example, you get there's a new person who is managing cybersecurity at NSA. His name is Ann Neuberger. Ann's been around for a long time at the agency, and she'd be a fantastic speaker if you were looking for somebody from NSA. She's quite open about her responsibilities. Of course, she's not going to tell you anything classified. But the agency is looking for ways in which it can reinforce security, not just in the defense industrial base, but more general industrial component of the domestic component in the U.S. There's also a great deal of concern, of course, about our key infrastructure and protecting that as well. There have been some attempts at cooperation between DHS and NSA, and there are historical tensions because one part of the organization is part of DoD and DHS is a separate department, and there are always interdepartmental complexities, I would guess is the best way to say it. I think information sharing, if it could be done in a way that protects information that needs to be protected, and yet can be used, can be used to prime detectors and things like that, that might be very helpful. I also note, by the way, that there's motion in the direction of cloud-based computing. We're one of the companies that offers that. And I've become increasingly persuaded that cloud-based systems can actually be really helpful in terms of creating a more secure environment. For one thing, the software of the cloud gets updated throughout the entire cloud all at once, so you don't have the problem of dribbling patches out and hoping that somebody is going to implement them in individual devices. Second thing that I've noticed is that, at least at Google, we had come to a conclusion about assumptions that we make in order to achieve a level of security that we believe our customers need and that we need ourselves for our own operation. And we came to the conclusion that we should assume that all networks have been compromised, including our own. And that led us to a design philosophy called Beyond Corp, Beyond Corporations. And that's publicly visible. And so I guess I haven't tried this, but I'm assuming if you do a Google search for Beyond Corp, that you will actually discover some white papers on the topic. But they make heavy use of cryptography, public key cryptography, in order to secure connections to strongly authenticate the parties have access to the system. So those are some of the things that come to my mind anyway about improving the situation that we're in right now.
Yeah, well, we're seeing a lot of ISACs and iShaos information sharing. In fact, we have another group that's more technology security focused, also meets monthly. And our next speaker is with the Media and Entertainment ISAC, talking about that kind of sharing. City of Los Angeles has an LA Cyber Lab that makes available indicators of compromise and all for sharing. What's your sense of how that whole space begins to evolve out?
So, well, one thing that we do at Google with regard to content, which is another big issue, especially for people that hold intellectual property and would like to have some control over that. So we use a lot of fingerprinting techniques in order to detect either video or audio that's been inappropriately uploaded into YouTube, for example. Mm-hmm. The problem with a lot of those techniques, though, is that it's certainly not perfect. And I have a personal experience once with this. I had received the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering in 2013, along with several colleagues. And they asked us, the prize givers asked us if we would just meet with a bunch of students and they would video record this, and then they wanted to upload the 90 minutes worth of Q&A and back and forth. And so I said, well, I'm happy to do that for you, because at that time, this was several years ago, they could only upload short, 12-minute things, and they had 90 minutes worth of stuff, but I had the authority to upload a bigger thing. So I uploaded this thing. And within a couple of minutes of my having uploaded the video, I got a message back saying your video has been canceled because the International Olympics Committee claims that you violated their copyright. And of course, I'm staring at this thing thinking, WTF. And then I went back and looked carefully at the video, and it turned out that one of the speakers was a physics guy, and he had taken a small, like 30 seconds or even less video from the Olympics, video broadcast to show kids that bicycles, are at an angle, but they don't fall over because they're going around the track at high enough speed. And that was what the IOC was claiming. And of course, what Google had done was to take the entire broadcast and fingerprint everything, and it detected it. And so I was impressed by how quickly I got clobbered. And then I had to go track down the person who managed the YouTube access controls and explain where this had come from. And we got it all sorted out. But it's a pretty impressive mechanism, but it can also make mistakes. And so, when you're dealing at scale, you have to automate, which means you have to put up with a certain amount of false positives. In our case, the YouTube upload rate is about 400 hours of video per minute. I mean, you let that thing, just let that sit in your head for a minute and do the math.
Yeah,
that's a lot of video.
Yeah, that certainly is. Let me first, before I ask another question, and ultimately I also want to see if other people have questions, and maybe you, George, as well. How much of your I'm so grateful for your time. I don't want to exceed what what you have available, but I would love to keep this discussion, alive. Yeah.
Well, I could spend probably another 10 minutes or so if that works for you.
Okay. That's great. Just before I open it up to others, I got one question I feel I must ask based on what you said. The idea of the cyber fire department, which I think is great, but from another perspective, that's an after the fact situation. Now there's a fire.
That's correct.
Ultimately, we're in the Smokey the Bear fire prevention world. Yeah. Just your thoughts on that difference and what have you.
This is a frequently asked question about what to do.
Yeah.
I have concluded that there is a sort of a syllogism of three things that we can do. The first thing we can do is to use technology to prevent the misbehavior that we are trying to inhibit. And so we use cryptography for some of those things. We use strong authentication. We use two-factor authentication. We do a variety of things in order to inhibit someone from actually taking an action that's harmful. But we know that's not going to work 100% of the time. So the next thing we can say is, look, if we catch you doing the following things, there will be consequences. That's post hoc enforcement. You could argue that that's, again, after the fire. And we also know, by the way, that doesn't always work either, just like, not all of us who are speeding are necessarily caught. And so since we know that even that is not going to be enough, although it's important for people to know that if there will be consequences if they are caught doing some of these harmful things, then the third thing you can say is, don't do that. It's just wrong. And that sounds kind of wimpy. But, remember that gravity is the weakest force in the universe. And yet when you have enough mass, it's pretty powerful. So the sun holds, Earth in its orbit. And so if we had a mass of people who agreed to certain kinds of norms of behavior, that actually puts pressure on people to conform to the norms. And so that's not a crazy thing to tell people don't do that, it's wrong. So those are the only three kinds of things that I can see to apply to this particular cyber problem.
Yeah, very profound. I mean, because you've laid it all out. Ultimately, it's, you know, inhibit it. It's against the law. You'll be punished, and it's immoral. Don't do it. It's lays it out that way. Let me open it up. Any
Well,
of you?
would you say that perhaps governance is part of the answer for that last problem, like what NIST is doing, and those kinds of, where would we look for some leadership in that?
Well, several things. First of all, there's an organization called the Global Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace. I'm a member of that commission, and we concluded that rather than pushing for international legal treaties, at least not initially, that we would argue instead for norms of behavior. And to give you an example, the first norm that the commission suggested was that we suggest broadly that people should not attack the core infrastructure of the internet. So they shouldn't attack the routers, they shouldn't cut off, you know, optical fiber lines, they shouldn't interfere with the Wi-Fi, they shouldn't do denial of service attacks, they shouldn't attack the domain name system. This is the core infrastructure of the internet. And it's a little bit like saying that even in wartime, we all generally agree not to bomb schools, school buses, hospitals, and things like that. Now, of course, do they get bombed? Yes, they do. There are some people who don't agree with those norms. And sometimes, of course, it's just a mistake. But having a common norm, which might someday become a treaty agreement, might be one path towards dealing with cyber governance. Now, most recently, the Secretary General of the UN commissioned a panel on what he called a high-level panel on digital cooperation. And he didn't say what that meant. He just said, you know, please consider that notion, whatever that could mean. So we turned in, I was on that panel too, we turned in that report last year in June. And then in the ensuing year, the panel put together a roadmap of digital cooperation. So to give you a sense for what was going on there, the idea was that in order to deal with some of the problems of internet that are international in scope, because the internet goes everywhere and it doesn't really notice when the packets have crossed international boundaries, which creates a problem, obviously, that the roadmap is looking at various things that we could do that might form international agreements. So to give you a concrete example, maybe we could come to agreement about how a digital signature is assigned to someone. You know, what bona fides have to be met in order to issue a digital signature. And if we can make a common agreement on what those bona fides are, then the digital signature might have weight in a court of law, no matter which country the legal proceeding is in. And so that's a kind of concrete example of trying to have agreements that are global in scope, or at least international in scope, that will facilitate safety and security in the internet. And of course, there are many other possibilities that come along. I feel compelled to say, however, that I don't think blockchain is the solution to everything. It might be the solution to something. I don't think it's, I would not use the pejorative, it's a solution looking for a problem, because it actually has utility in some cases, but you have to figure out at what scale and for what transaction rate and how long you need to remember everything that's in the blockchain. So that's sort of where I end up on that one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that actually reminds me, there was a science fiction story I remember reading as a child. Maybe it was a Borges, about the man who wrote his diary every day, and it would take him longer and longer each day to write his diary, to where he no longer had time to do anything but write his diary. And you know, the time plays out. Yeah. Let me open it up. George, you got another question? Steve, I see your hand raised. Steve Krantz, also on our board, Vint.
Thank you so much, Vint, for your talk. I'm focused on individual training individuals how to protect themselves. I've just written a book about it, and I've come to the conclusion that all you can do is minimize risk. You can't eliminate risk.
That's correct. I agree.
You're shaking your head. We both agree on that. So where I'm, and I can see an analogy with as you described the cyberspace and all the problems we have between what's happening with the pandemic right now. The lack of leadership, the lack of a top-down, clear set of messages to the public is causing the chaos that we're seeing and many deaths, which is frightening to me personally as a senior. And one thing we have in common is our hair color. So what I would like to see is because I have a top 10 that I believe minimizes risk. And that should be, in my mind, that's probably enough for the general public to go from a completely risky, if you don't have any practices whatsoever, you have a top 10 of things that, for example, two-factor authentication would be one of those top 10, as you mentioned. How do we have the possibility of getting that kind of leadership from, you mentioned the Global Commission, to come out, here's the top 10, and all of the other organizations that supplement or contribute here's the top 10, ladies and gentlemen, teach your children and so forth.
So NIST actually has a program called NICE, N-I-C-E, and I don't honestly remember the specific, what the acronym stood for, but it was about teaching people how to be safer in the internet, and more generally just safer in the cyberspace. So that's just an example of one agency that's trying to do something. There had been a cybersecurity czar in the White House, but Mr. Trump eliminated that position. And I'd like to see that come back again. I don't know whether we could argue for a cabinet level post, but I think somebody ought to be focused on cybersecurity because the risk factors are so high for so much of our entire social and economic enterprise. The pandemic, by the way, the parallel here is that the pandemic showed how dependent we were on our ability to work together in close proximity. Think about a meatpacking plant, for example. Think about schools. Think about barbershops. Think of all the various things that we rely on that require proximity. And suddenly we couldn't do that anymore because the virus was propagating so readily. The same argument might be made, a similar kind of argument might be made about the cyberspace environment. We are very, very dependent on computer-based stuff now, extremely dependent on it. And so when it doesn't work, for some reason, there are all kinds of side effects that are significant. They really harm our social and economic environment. Now, the other thing that we have that's problematic, and I'm not sure where you would put this in your 10 things, is that the social networking applications have feedback loops in them that are quite harmful. They reward extreme behavior. Because when you think about the reward factors, think about Twitter, how many followers do you have? Well, you get more followers if you say extreme things. We have some good evidence of that. How many videos did people like, or how many followers did you have? Well, depending on how extreme your videos are, you might get more followers. So there's this feedback loop that shows up. And I think we have not understood well enough the social and sociological and psychological effects of our technology. And so I would argue that we should actually have anthropologists and psychologists and neuroscientists participating in the development of some of these applications to help understand how they can be harmful. I think we've not done a good job of that. I am out of time at this point.
Yeah. I'm just so grateful you took this time. And I think that's a good place you're ending as well. I mean, ultimately, you're talking about this is one of those challenges that we have to face, we have to meet. I'm a big believer in something Robert Kennedy said of this is the future is not a given, it's an accomplishment. This is something we have to do. I want to thank you very much for all of your accomplishments and for all the wisdom you have just shared with us today. Thank you so very, very much.
Well, you're very kind to say that. Look, I'm this old fart. You should always take whatever I have to say with a grain of salt. But I hope that you're very successful, because we clearly need more efforts along the lines that you're pursuing. So I hope that your ideas infect other people in a good way. So we get them. Okay, thanks again for your time.
Thank you, Vin. We'll see you around, all right? Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.